There's a specific kind of silence that only exists at 3 a.m. when you're sitting alone in a parking garage, staring at a folder of documents that could destroy someone you once loved like a brother. Not the silence of peace, not the silence of sleep, the silence of a decision that once made cannot be undone, the kind that hums in your chest like a live wire buried just beneath the skin. I sat there for 47 minutes before I turned the key in the ignition. I didn't go home. I drove to his house, and I sat outside it too. This is the story of how I built a man up, watched him burn everything I ever trusted him with, and then, very slowly, very deliberately, and with complete clarity of conscience, made sure the world saw exactly who he really was. My name is Donovan Reese. And I need you to understand something before we go any further. I am not someone who does things in anger. I never have been. I was raised by a father who told me more times than I can count that a man who acts from rage is a man who hands his enemy the weapon. So when everything in this story happened, and it happened slowly the way all the worst things do, I waited, I planned, I made sure that when the moment came it was surgical. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a parking lot in Columbus, Ohio, to a job interview that changed both of our lives. Part 1. The beginning of everything. It was October of 2014. I was 26 years old, freshly relocated from Detroit, sitting in my car outside the Meridian Logistics Group headquarters, rehearsing my answers for what felt like the 100th time. I had my folder pressed against my chest, my shoes were polished, and I was absolutely terrified. I was interviewing for a junior supply chain analyst position. Meridian was one of the largest third-party logistics firms in the Midwest, 1,500 employees, contracts with some of the biggest retail names in the country. For a 26-year-old kid with a data analytics degree and 18 months of experience at a regional freight company, it was a reach. But it was my reach. And I needed it. I got to the lobby 12 minutes early, which meant I was sitting in a row of ergonomic chairs across from the receptionist, when the elevator doors opened and a guy walked out moving fast, adjusting his collar, looking mildly panicked. He was maybe my age, tall, with the kind of effortlessly readable face that made you feel like you'd known him for years. He glanced around the lobby, clocked me in my suit, and the panic on his face softened into something like amused relief. "You're not here for the junior analyst position, are you?" he said. "I am," I said. He laughed. Not meanly, just the laugh of someone who'd just learned something useful. He dropped into the chair 2 seats down from me, loosened his tie slightly, then immediately tightened it again. "Callum Shepherd," he said, extending his hand. "Donovan Reese." We shook hands. He had a firm grip, the kind that people practice. I remember noticing that and deciding I liked him anyway. "How'd you hear about the position?" he asked. "LinkedIn posting. You?" "My uncle golfs with one of the regional directors." He said it without any embarrassment, which I respected. "I'm not going to pretend that's not why I'm here, but I also did my homework, so." He tapped his folder. "We'll see." We talked for maybe 8 minutes before they called his name. He stood up, smoothed his jacket, and turned to me. "Good luck, Donovan. I mean that, though I'm also hoping you bomb it." I laughed. "Same to you." He grinned and disappeared through the door. I didn't bomb it, and neither did he. Meridian, apparently feeling generous, offered us both positions the following week. I found out later that Callum had called the hiring manager the day after his interview and suggested they bring both of us on, that he'd done some research on me online and thought I'd add complementary skills to the team. He'd gone out of his way to help me get a job we'd just competed for. That was Callum Shepherd. At least, that was the version of him I knew first. We started the same Monday in November. They sat us in adjacent workstations in the analytics pod on the third floor, a deliberately designed arrangement meant to foster collaboration between junior hires. But for us, it wouldn't have mattered where they put us. We would have found each other anyway. Within 3 weeks, we were eating lunch together every day. Within 2 months, we were the last 2 people in the office most evenings, not because we were told to be, but because we'd gotten competitive about the carrier optimization project we'd been assigned, and neither of us was willing to let the other one get further ahead. I want to be clear about something. Callum was genuinely talented. I'm going to rewrite history to make him the villain from the start. He had an instinct for relationships, for reading people, for knowing what someone needed to hear, for walking into a room and making the temperature rise a little. He was the kind of person who remembered your spouse's name and your kid's sports team and your mother's health scare and asked about all of them months later like it was nothing. People loved him. He could make you feel, within 20 minutes of conversation, like you were the most interesting person he'd ever spent time with. I was different. I was better with numbers than with rooms. I was thorough where he was quick. I was methodical where he was instinctive. Together we were, and I know how this sounds, but it's just true, exceptional. Our combined output on that first project got us both fast-tracked to a mid-level review 6 months earlier than standard. But beyond work, beyond strategy, beyond the metrics and the wins, Callum was my friend, my real friend. The kind of friendship that adult men don't talk about enough because it doesn't have a cultural script. We weren't just colleagues who got along. We were genuinely close. We talked about our families, our fears, our failures. We argued about everything from basketball to economic theory, and neither of us ever felt the need to back down from the argument because we both knew it wasn't personal. He was there when my father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's. He drove with me to Detroit on a Friday after work, without being asked, without making a production of it. He sat in my parents' kitchen and talked football with my dad for 2 hours while I helped my mother process the paperwork from the neurologist. He didn't bring it up at work on Monday. He just texted me, "Your old man is sharp as a tack. He'll be fine." I was there when his engagement fell apart. His fiancée, Renata, called it off in February of 2016, 8 months before the wedding. He showed up at my apartment at 10:30 on a Tuesday night, said nothing, and I handed him a beer and put on a game we both didn't watch. He slept on my couch. We never talked about it in any deep way. He didn't need that. He just needed to not be alone, so I made sure he wasn't. That's what we were to each other. That's the baseline you need to understand. Because what comes later only lands properly if you know what it cost me to realize it. By 2018, we'd both been promoted twice. I was a senior supply chain analyst. Callum had taken a slight different path. He'd moved toward client relations and business development, leveraging that natural magnetism of his. He was still technically on the analytics side, but his role increasingly involved managing relationships with Meridian's top-tier contracts. He was good at it, very good. It was around this time that we started talking seriously about going out on our own. The idea had been percolating for at least a year. We'd both seen enough of how Meridian operated, the inefficiencies, the bureaucratic drag, the senior leadership's consistent failure to invest in the technology that would have made the whole operation leaner and more profitable. We talked about it the way you talk about a vacation you'll someday take. Someday, when the time is right, when we have enough saved, when the moment makes sense. The moment started to feel real in the spring of 2018 when a former Meridian client, a mid-sized furniture retailer called Hartfield Home, reached out to me personally. Their supply chain was a mess. They'd left Meridian the previous year after a contract dispute, and they'd been struggling to find a replacement partner that could handle their complexity. Hartfield's operations director, a meticulous woman named Priya Subramaniam, had kept my contact information from a project we'd collaborated on 18 months earlier. She emailed me on a Thursday afternoon with 6 words, "Are you still at Meridian?" I called Callum before I replied. "This is it," he said before I'd finished explaining. "It might be nothing." "It's not nothing, Donovan. Hartfield does 60 million in annual revenue. Their logistics contract alone is worth—" "I know what it's worth. So meet with her. We'd be taking on a serious client before we even have a legal entity." "Then let's form one." He paused. "I've been talking to a business attorney, just exploratory. I didn't want to push. But if you're in, I'm in, and I think we can do this." I took a breath. I looked at my apartment, my comfortable, cautious, medium-stakes apartment, and I thought about my father, who'd worked for someone else his entire life and never once owned anything that bore his name. "I'm in," I said. 2 months later, Reese & Shepherd Logistics Consulting was incorporated in the state of Ohio. Priya Subramaniam signed our first contract the following week. Part 2. The Empire We Built. I won't compress the years between 2018 and 2022 into a paragraph because those years deserve more than that. They were hard years. They were the best years of my professional life. We worked constantly, both of us, in a way that was only possible because we trusted each other completely. Here's how we divided it, officially. I handled the analytical and operational backbone of the business: carrier vetting, routing optimization, data modeling, contract compliance, internal reporting, everything that required rigor, precision, and patience. Callum handled the front-facing work: client acquisition, partnership development, pitching, relationship management, everything that required charm, presence, and adaptability. It worked spectacularly. By the end of 2019, we had 7 clients. By mid-2021, we had 19. We'd hired our first full-time employees, 4 of them, and were operating out of a proper office space in the Short North District. Our revenue that year crossed $2 million for the first time. We celebrated with a dinner that Callum's idea had been, at a restaurant neither of us could fully afford yet, and ordered a bottle of wine that was more than I'd ever spent on a single bottle. We made a toast. I still know exactly what he said. To the fact that the best decisions I ever made involved you. I believed him. I believed every word of it, because I had no reason not to. The business had 2 bank accounts, an operating account that both of us could access, and a capital reserve account that required dual authorization for withdrawals. That was my idea, and Callum had agreed immediately, had actually praised it as smart governance for a partnership. We had a formal partnership agreement drafted by his attorney contact and reviewed by a second firm I'd hired independently. 60-40 split, with me holding the majority stake as the operating partner. My contribution to the structure of the business had simply been greater, and Callum had accepted that without argument. On paper, everything was clean. Everything was above board. Everything was exactly what 2 smart, ethical, aligned partners should have built. I want you to hold on to that image. I want you to remember that picture of us at that restaurant with that bottle of wine, toasting to each other. Because what I am about to tell you will make you understand that the most devastating betrayals don't happen in moments of impulse. They happen in secret over time by someone who has learned exactly how much you trust them and decided to use it. Part 3. The first cracks. The first sign that something was wrong came in January of 2022, and I almost missed it. We had a client called Vantara Outdoor, a sporting goods distributor based in Cincinnati that had come on board the previous spring. Callum had brought them in, which was typical. He managed the relationship, which was also typical. My involvement was on the back end, designing their carrier mix, modeling their seasonal demand patterns, monitoring their compliance metrics. In January, I was running a routine reconciliation of Q4 invoices when I noticed a discrepancy in the service fees we'd billed Vantara. Nothing dramatic, a line item for strategic carrier consulting that didn't correspond to any project I recognized or any carrier engagement we'd logged. The amount was $4,200. I flagged it mentally. I told myself it was probably something Callum had arranged and forgotten to document. He wasn't always thorough about internal documentation, which had been a recurring minor friction between us. I sent him a message. "Hey, can you pull up the carrier consulting work we billed Vantara for in Q4? I don't see the project in our system." He replied within an hour, "Yeah, that was some extra advisory work I did with their ops director in November. I'll write it up and get it in the system." I accepted that. I moved on, but something snagged in me. Not suspicion exactly. More like a small stone in your shoe that you keep meaning to stop and remove and keep forgetting about until it's rubbed a blister. 3 weeks later, I was reviewing a different client's invoices in a pharmaceutical distributor called Nexvera Fulfillment, and I found another one, different amount. Brand partnership facilitation, $7,000. I sat with that one longer. Brand partnership facilitation wasn't a service we offered. It wasn't in our service catalog. It wasn't language we used internally, and I had no record of any engagement that would have warranted it. I went back to our shared project management system and searched every communication thread I could find between Callum and the Nexvera account. Nothing. I went back to the Vantara file. The carrier consulting write-up that Callum had promised to submit never appeared. I'd forgotten to follow up, and he'd let it quietly disappear. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that I'd spent 4 years trusting this man with half my professional life, and he'd never given me a reason not to, and that a few documentation gaps didn't justify the spiral of thought I was beginning to feel forming at the base of my skull. So I did the thing that felt most natural to me. I started quietly building a record, not aggressively, not even with full belief that something was wrong. I just started keeping a parallel file. Every invoice, every service line that didn't map to a documented project, every client communication that referred to work I had no visibility into. I kept it on my personal drive, encrypted, and told no one. By March of 2022, I had 11 entries. The confrontation, if you can call it that because it was still so gentle at that point, came on a Wednesday evening. We'd been working late, the two of us alone in the office. And I'd given myself a deadline. If I didn't say something that night, I never would. I waited until we were cleaning up to leave. I kept my voice easy. "Hey, I want to ask you about something. And I want you to know up front that I'm not coming at you sideways. I just need to understand it." He looked up from his bag. His expression was open, attentive, the face of someone who has nothing to hide and nothing to fear. "Sure. What's up?" "Some of the service line items I'm seeing on the client invoices, I've been having trouble matching them to projects. It's happened a few times now. I don't want it to become a financial reporting issue. Can we set up a process where you loop me in on any advisory work before it gets billed?" He didn't hesitate for a single beat. "Absolutely, that's on me. I've been moving fast on some of the relationship stuff and not documenting it properly. I'll be better about it." He paused. "Is there something specific that's worrying you?" "Not worrying me exactly. I just want to make sure we're both seeing the same picture." "Of course, always." He smiled. "You're the operations brain here, Donovan. You should be seeing everything. Let me put together a summary of the advisory engagements and get it to you by Friday. He sent me a summary by Friday. It was detailed, reasonable, and explained every item I'd flagged in plausible terms. Each service line had a brief description, a client contact name attached to it, and a note about the value delivered. I read it carefully. I cross-referenced it against my file. And then I did something I'd never done before in 4 years of partnership. I called 2 of the client contacts mentioned in his summary and asked very casually, framed as routine quality assurance, whether they could speak briefly to the advisory work we'd done for them. The first contact, from Vantara, was confused. He didn't remember any dedicated advisory session in November. He said Callum had joined a regular call and offered some suggestions, but it wasn't a formal engagement. The second contact from Nexvera said, and I wrote this down word for word, "I'm not sure what brand partnership facilitation means in terms of your service structure, but we were happy with the support." Which meant someone had explained that charge to her after the fact, and she'd accepted it without question because the amounts were small relative to the overall contract. I hung up both calls feeling like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left. Part 4. The Unraveling. I spent the next 6 weeks doing something that I was very well trained to do. Auditing. Not an official one. Nothing that would trigger any alarms. I was methodical, careful, and patient. I worked early in the mornings before anyone else arrived and late in the evenings after everyone left. I accessed every invoice we'd issued since the company's founding. I cross-referenced them against our project management system, our email archives, our carrier contracts, our client communication logs. What I found changed the architecture of everything I thought I knew. Callum had been running a parallel billing operation inside our business for, as best as I could determine, at least 18 months. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. He would identify clients who were either inattentive to line item review or who trusted our firm strongly enough not to question small additions. He would bill them for services that were either grossly inflated versions of minor work or entirely fabricated. The amounts were deliberately modest, never large enough to trigger scrutiny, always small enough to be written off as overhead or advisory fees by a client's accounting team. 4,000 here, 7,000 there, 12,000 on one occasion, split across 2 billing cycles. In total, across 14 clients and 18 months, Callum had generated approximately $219,000 in fraudulent billings. And because he managed the client-facing relationships, because he was the one who submitted the invoices for processing, because our internal financial review process had trusted him to document his own work, it had all flowed through our business accounts without any flag. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what he'd done with the money. He hadn't taken it directly. He was too careful for that. He'd structured it through a service entity, a single-member LLC called Shepherd Advisory Group, which I had never known existed, that he'd established 18 months before I found any of this. The invoices billed to our clients were, in the final layer of the structure, paid out as subcontractor fees from our operating account to Shepherd Advisory Group. On our books, it looked like legitimate contractor expenses. On his personal books, it looked like consulting income from a separate business. He had set this up before the idea of fraud had ever crossed my mind as a possibility. He had been planning this while we were working late together and eating lunch together and making toast to each other with expensive wine. I sat with that reality for a long time. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that. What I felt wasn't grief, not at first. It was a kind of total systemic shutdown, the emotional equivalent of a power grid going dark. I sat at my desk at 6 in the morning, in a silent office with 14 browser tabs open and a folder of annotated evidence on my screen, and I felt absolutely nothing. The feeling came later, in waves, in my car, in my kitchen, in the shower, in the 47 minutes in the parking garage I mentioned at the start of this story. I need to tell you about the hardest part of discovering that someone you love has betrayed you on this level. It's not the anger. The anger comes, and it's clean, and it makes sense, and it has momentum. It's everything that comes before the anger. It's the rewinding. You go back over every memory with new eyes, every dinner, every late night, every conversation where he looked you in the face and asked how you were doing. And now you're looking at all of it through a different lens, and you're trying to figure out what was real and what was performance. You're asking yourself, when exactly did he decide? Was it before we incorporated? Was it while I was handling my father's medical appointments and he was covering my clients? Was it at that restaurant when he made that toast? You replay things that seemed insignificant and try to find the seam where the deception was sewn in, and sometimes you can find it. And sometimes the cruelest thing is that you can't, that some of what you shared was real, was genuine, was exactly what it looked like, because that makes it worse somehow. Clean evil is easier to process than evil that grew slowly out of something true. I lost 15 pounds over 8 weeks. I stopped sleeping past 4 in the morning. I started going to the gym at 5 a.m., not for health, but because the physical exhaustion was the only thing that could quiet the noise in my head long enough to get through a workday. I told no one, not my sister in Detroit, not my father, no one at work, especially not Callum, who I continued to see every single day in our shared office, at our shared lunches, with my complete and unchanged face. I need you to understand how hard that was. How many times I looked at him and felt the words press against the back of my teeth and swallowed them. How many times I watched him laugh, watched him charm a new prospect on a call, watched him be exactly who he'd always been in every visible way, and had to remind myself that this version of him I was watching was still somehow true, was still genuinely him, and that was the thing I couldn't reconcile. He was both. He had always been both. The man who drove to Detroit with me for my father and the man who stole $200,000 from our shared business were not two different people. They were one person. And I'd loved the former without ever knowing the latter existed. Part 5. The decision. It took me exactly 3 months from discovery to decision. I spent those 3 months doing 3 things. First, I continued building the evidence file, methodically, comprehensively, date-stamped and cross-referenced. By the time I was done, it was airtight, not good enough airtight, court case airtight, the kind of documentation that leaves no interpretive room. Second, I consulted a lawyer, not Callum's attorney contact, a different firm entirely, one I found independently, paid out of pocket, and met with twice in a coffee shop, nowhere near our office. I told them what I had. They told me what my options were. Third, and most importantly, I thought. I thought about what I actually wanted, not what felt satisfying to imagine in my worst moments, not what rage demanded, not what shame suggested. What did I actually specifically want as an outcome? I didn't want to just recover the money. I could have gone straight to civil litigation and probably won, but that would have taken 2 to 3 years, cost significant legal fees, and the final outcome would have been a judgment, a document that said Callum Shepherd owed me money which he might or might not have ever paid in full. It would have been a transaction, a financial correction. That wasn't what I wanted. I wanted people to know. I wanted the exact same audience that had watched him build a reputation as a trusted, charming, extraordinary business partner to watch that reputation decompose in real time. I wanted the clients who'd been billed for services they'd barely received to understand what had happened. I wanted the industry contacts, the referral partners, the colleagues who'd praised him at every networking event we'd attended together. I wanted them to know who they'd actually been dealing with, and I wanted him to feel, at least once in his life, the specific helplessness of watching something you built get taken away from you by someone else's actions, not by market forces or bad luck or your own mistakes, by someone you trusted, by someone who had decided without telling you that what you had together was less important than what he could extract from it. I wanted him to feel what I felt. So I planned it accordingly. Part 6. The Architecture of Consequences. The first thing I did was protect myself. I removed my personal liability from the fraudulent billing scheme by generating a comprehensive internal audit report, signed, dated, and formally logged, that documented my discovery of the discrepancies, the investigation I'd conducted, and my findings. I submitted this report to our business attorney, to our business bank, and retained a copy with my personal lawyer. This established a clear paper trail proving I had no knowledge of or participation in the scheme. The second thing I did was separate our financial infrastructure. Over a period of 6 weeks, I restructured our operating account access so that all invoice approvals required dual authorization, both signatures. I implemented a new accounting software platform that created automatic flags for any billing that didn't correspond to a logged project. I told Callum this was a growth stage upgrade for our financial systems, something we'd discussed previously, and he accepted it completely. He even thanked me for handling it. By restructuring the accounts, I effectively ended the scheme without Callum knowing I'd found it. He could no longer bill clients for ghost services without my sign-off. The tap was closed. He didn't panic, because as far as he knew, nothing had changed. But here's what I was actually doing. I was giving him time to feel safe, to believe the new systems were just administrative improvements, to relax back into his routine, to stop watching for signs that I knew. I needed him comfortable. Comfortable people make mistakes. The third thing I did was research every client relationship he owned. Every client Callum had brought in or managed had come with a paper trail. Introductions, proposals, meeting notes, email threads. What I found when I looked carefully was that while some of those relationships were genuinely his, built on real rapport and real delivery, several of them were built primarily on my work product, my systems, my analysis, presented to clients under the banner of our shared firm. He'd been the face, I'd been the engine, which was the deal we'd struck. But what I hadn't accounted for was what that asymmetry meant in practice. Several of our most important clients didn't have deep relationships with me. They talked to Callum, they trusted Callum, they would follow Callum if he ever left. That insight became the most important variable in my plan. Fourth, I made one very specific phone call. Priya Subramaniam, Hartfield Home, our first client. The woman who'd sent me 6 words in 2018 and started everything. I'd maintained a real working relationship with Priya throughout the years, not through Callum, but through the ongoing quality of the operational work I did for her company. She knew who was actually responsible for keeping Hartfield's supply chain running. She knew that because I'd made sure she knew it, not through politics, but through delivery. Every quarterly review, every carrier renegotiation, every exception report, it all had my name on it in writing because I was the one who produced it. I asked Priya for a coffee, off-site, informal, just an update conversation. We met on a Thursday afternoon at a cafe 3 miles from their offices. I told her calmly and without drama that I was becoming concerned about the long-term direction of Rees and Shepherd Logistics, that I was exploring what a restructured arrangement might look like, and that I wanted to understand whether Hartfield would be open to a direct service relationship with me personally if circumstances changed. She put down her cup and looked at me for a moment. "Donovan," she said, "we've always been working with you. The name on the door is secondary to us." I thanked her. I told her I'd be in touch. I drove back to the office, feeling for the first time in months like something was finally moving in my direction. Over the following 4 weeks, I had similar conversations, carefully, sequentially, professionally, with the key contacts at 6 other clients. 5 of them said some version of what Priya had said. 2 were more diplomatic, but their messages were readable. In total, I had verbal commitments. No contracts, nothing. Binding yet from 7 of our 19 clients that they would follow me if I launched independently. 7 clients representing approximately 68% of our annual revenue. I had not yet told Callum any of this. 5th, the regulatory piece. I'll be honest with you, this was the part I sat with the longest. Not because I doubted it, but because once I did it, there was no version of this that ended quietly. I compiled a full disclosure package, the invoices, the cross-references, the Shepherd Advisory Group, LLC documents I'd obtained through public business registry records, the client confirmation calls I'd recorded with consent, the annotated timeline of the scheme. I submitted it in 2 places simultaneously. 1, a formal complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, which has jurisdiction over business fraud between commercial entities. 2, a detailed private communication to the CFOs or operations directors at every client who had been fraudulently billed, not to embarrass, but to fulfill what I believed was an ethical obligation to disclose financial harm they'd been subjected to, and which they deserved to recover. I sent the regulatory filing on a Monday. I sent the client disclosures on the same day, timed to arrive in inboxes at 9 a.m. Then I drove to the office. Part 7. The day. Everything collapsed by 10:15 that morning. I had received 4 emails and 2 phone calls from clients. By 11, I had received a call from our business bank's compliance department. By 11:40, Callum's phone had been ringing for 40 minutes straight, and he had gone from mildly distracted to visibly pale. He had no idea what was happening. The calls were coming in from clients from numbers he recognized, and whatever they were telling him was landing like consecutive body blows. I watched him from across the office. He kept looking at me. I kept working. At 12:14, he walked to my desk. "Donovan." His voice was different than I'd ever heard it. Compressed, controlled, but barely. "What did you do?" I looked up from my screen. I kept my face completely neutral. "I filed an audit disclosure," I said, "with the AG's office, and I notified the affected clients." The silence between us was the loudest thing I've ever heard. "How long have you known?" 3 months. He stared at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't entirely read. Shock, yes, but also something that almost looked like relief, like a man who's been carrying something unbearable for too long and has just been told he can put it down. "Donovan, I don't." The word came out flat and final. "I don't need an explanation. I don't need an apology. I spent 3 months thinking about whether I wanted either of those things, and I don't." "We can? We can fix this. I can pay it back, all of it. Whatever it takes." "You're going to have the opportunity to do that, Callum, probably in front of a civil court." I paused. "And possibly a criminal one." His face went the color of notebook paper. "Donovan!" "I'd suggest you call your attorney. Today." I stood up. "I'm taking tomorrow as a working day from home. When I come back in on Wednesday, I'll have a formal dissolution framework for you to review. Our partnership agreement has a termination for cause clause. I intend to invoke it." I picked up my laptop and my bag, and I walked to the elevator. He called my name once before the doors closed. I didn't turn around. Part 8. The aftermath. The dissolution process took 4 months. It was not clean. It was not friendly. It was conducted entirely through attorneys across a negotiating table that I never once sat at in person by design. The outcome, the partnership, was formally dissolved. I retained the operating entity, the client contracts, the proprietary systems, and processes I'd built, and the Rees and Shepherd name, which I subsequently rebranded to Rees Logistics Consulting, removing his name entirely. He received a negotiated buyout that reflected his minority equity stake, minus a deduction for the fraudulent billing amount, which was formalized as a civil judgment against him as part of the settlement. The Ohio AG's office completed their review 6 months after my filing. The determination was that the conduct rose to the level of commercial fraud under Ohio statute. Callum was referred for criminal prosecution. His attorney negotiated a plea arrangement, 18 months of probation, mandatory restitution to the affected clients, and a permanent civil judgment on his record. No prison time, I'll be honest. Part of me had wanted otherwise, but a smaller, quieter part of me was relieved. I didn't want his suffering to be physical. I wanted it to be professional. I wanted it to follow him. I wanted it to be the first thing that came up when someone searched his name. And it was. Callum had leveraged his Meridian connections and his Rees and Shepherd reputation to build a significant professional network over 8 years. LinkedIn presence, conference speaking, industry newsletter appearances, a reputation as a rising operator in the Midwest logistics space. He'd worked hard to build that image. He'd been genuinely proud of it. Every professional contact he had saw the Ohio AG judgment filing. Its public record. In an industry built almost entirely on trust, clients are handing you their supply chains, their vendor relationships, their financial integrity. A fraud conviction, even at the plea level, is effectively a career-ending event. Within 8 months of the settlement, Callum had lost every industry affiliation he'd held. A regional trade association he'd served on the advisory board have quietly removed him. A conference where he'd been slated to speak the following year withdrew the invitation without public explanation. 2 former Meridian colleagues who'd been referral sources for years went silent. I didn't coordinate any of this. I didn't make calls, didn't send emails, didn't campaign. I didn't need to. In a trust-based industry, public record speaks loudly enough on its own. Part 9. What I built in the wreckage. The part of this story that I didn't expect, the part that still catches me off guard when I think about it, is what happened to me. I'd been so focused on the plan, on the execution, on the careful construction of every piece of the response, that I hadn't fully considered what would be waiting on the other side of it. I'd been living inside the strategy for so long that I hadn't thought carefully about the life I'd be walking back into once it was done. What was waiting was harder than I'd anticipated, and better. Harder, because the anger, when it finally had nowhere left to go, turned into grief. Real grief. The kind you have for a person who is still alive, which is somehow worse than the other kind because there's no clean social container for it. No ritual, no designated mourning period, no acceptable way to tell people. I am in pain because someone I loved like a brother turned out to be something I never understood. I had to carry that in private mostly. I processed it slowly in the way that people process things they can't speak out loud, which is badly and non-linearly and with a lot of late evenings that felt like they'd never end. I went to therapy. I want to say that clearly without any embarrassment because I think it mattered. I found a therapist who specialized in professional betrayal, business partnerships, financial fraud, the specific psychological damage of having your trust weaponized by someone you chose deliberately. She helped me understand something that I've thought about almost every day since. The thing Callum did wasn't just financial, it wasn't fraud. It was identity fraud. He had presented himself as one person and operated as another, and the cost of that wasn't just $200,000. It was the coherent story I'd been telling myself about my own judgment, about my ability to know people, about whether the things I trusted were trustworthy. Rebuilding that, rebuilding the internal certainty that I could read a room, read a person, read a situation, took longer than rebuilding the business. And the business took a long time. But here's the better part. Reese Logistics Consulting, in its first full year of independent operation, generated more revenue than Reese and Shepherd had in any of its final 2 years as a partnership. The 7 clients I'd secured before the dissolution stayed, and 5 of them expanded their contracts. 4 new clients came through referrals in the first 18 months, including one that became our largest account to date. I hired 6 full-time employees within 2 years. I brought on a business development partner, someone I vetted exhaustively, whose references I personally called, whose financial history I reviewed, whose alignment with my values I stress-tested over 6 months before we signed anything. Her name is Wenling Park. She's sharp, meticulous, direct, to the point of occasionally being uncomfortable, and she is exactly nothing like Callum Shepherd. She's better. The business is mine now, fully, legally, completely mine. My name on the door, my systems inside, my clients on the roster. No one else's signature required for anything. I think about my father, about what he told me, about men who act from rage and hand their enemies the weapon. And I think about how close I came in those early months to doing exactly that. To marching into Callum's office and detonating everything at once in a blaze of righteous fury that would have felt spectacular for about 48 hours before costing me the business, the clients, my professional standing, and my legal protection. The patience cost me everything. It also saved me everything. Part 10. The last time I saw him. A year and 4 months after the dissolution, I saw Callum Shepherd one final time. It was at a gas station of all places. On a Tuesday afternoon near the highway, the kind of anonymous errand that has no meaning until it does. I pulled up to a pump, and there he was, 2 pumps over, in a car I didn't recognize. He was wearing a jacket I'd seen him wear many times. He looked the same, and somehow entirely different. Smaller, not physically. He was still tall, still had the same build. Just smaller in some way I couldn't articulate. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. There was a breath, a full second of nothing, when neither of us moved. Then he looked away. He finished pumping his gas, got into his car, and drove onto the highway without looking back. I stood there for a moment. I waited to feel something, rage, satisfaction, grief, anything large enough to match the occasion. What I felt instead was a kind of muted clarity, like looking at a scar and understanding, finally, that it's just skin, that it doesn't control you, that it doesn't define the tissue underneath. I pumped my gas. I drove back to my office. I had a 4 o'clock call with a new client prospect. I was 8 minutes early, which I always am. The call went well. Epilogue. Here's what I know now that I didn't know before. People who are capable of betraying you at the level that Callum betrayed me are not monsters in any useful sense of the word. They're not cartoons. They don't have tells that would have been obvious to you from the start, if only you'd been smarter. They are often, and this is the part that stays with me most, genuinely capable of the good things you believed about them. The warmth is real. The intelligence is real. The loyalty in some form at some moment was probably real too. Real. What makes them capable of what they do isn't the absence of those things. It's the presence of something else alongside them. A capacity for compartmentalization that most people simply don't have. The ability to hold 2 incompatible realities and operate in both simultaneously without the friction becoming unbearable. I don't know why Callum needed the money badly enough to do what he did. I'll never know. His attorney in the early stages of negotiation, sent a letter suggesting that he'd been under significant financial pressure from a private investment that had gone badly, losses that he'd been too embarrassed to disclose. Maybe that's true. Maybe there are other explanations. I stopped caring at some point which one was accurate, because the explanation was never going to change the fact. What I care about now, what I actually carry forward from all of this, is something more practical and more personal. I trust differently now. Not less. Differently. I know what questions to ask, what documentation to require, what patterns to notice in the early stages of a professional relationship before the trust becomes weight-bearing. I'm not paranoid. I'm informed. There's a meaningful difference between those two things, and it took losing something significant to understand it. I built something real. I watched someone I loved try to hollow it out from the inside, quietly, over time, while smiling at me over a lunch table. And when I found out, I didn't destroy it in rage. I waited, I thought, I moved carefully. I took everything back that was mine and made sure the world understood why. The business is real. My name is on the door. My judgment, tested now, proven, recalibrated, is what drives every decision inside it. My father called me the week the dissolution was finalized. I hadn't told him everything, only enough, that the partnership had ended due to a serious breach of trust, that I was moving forward independently, that I was going to be okay. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, You handled it right." "Yes," I said. "Then it's done," he said. "Build something better." So that's what I did. That's the end of the story. Not a cinematic ending, not a dramatic last confrontation with cameras rolling, just a gas station, a man who looked away, and a 4 o'clock call I was 8 minutes early for. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who tried to take everything from you is simply to still be there, still building, still standing, still early.